Over the last 3 years, 4 years, something like that, I've been on quite a surreal journey to some of the remotest parts of the country in search of Britain's lost cities and ghost towns and vanished villages, places lost to oblivion. So these are places that were once brimming with life and dreams and church bells and more. And now, more often than not, they're just kind of spectral echoes rutted into the ground, if there's anything left at all. And it took me from St Kilda in the Outer Hebrides to Skara Brae on Orkney, all the way down to lost cities buried beneath forests in Wales, as well as places on the south coast. And this was not just a kind of completely morbid exercise in digging up these kind of obscure places. It was also meant to kind of bring home the fragility and transience of the present, and also more ominously act in some cases as a sort of awful premonition of our likely future. And it was also a time of great transition for me personally, of great sort of loss and bereavement. And I hoped that by ruminating on all these ruins, I might sort of become less of a ruin myself. And I'll tell you how that went at the end. So the first place I went to is a place called Skara Brae. You have? Yeah. How many of you? Can you put your hand up if you've been there? Oh, a lot of you. Okay, we should have held the festival up there. This is, for those of you who haven't been there, this is quite a striking place to visit because it doesn't look, when you just look at that, I mean, the first thing I thought was it looked like a kind of crazy golf course. This is on a freezing cold beach on Orkney. But what you're actually looking at in that image there is something that's older than the pyramids, something that's older even than Stonehenge. It's amongst one of the oldest built structures anywhere in Northern Europe. And it was built, believe it or not, around about 3200 BC, which is really hard to get your head around. This sort of relationship with deep time when you go that far back and there's absolutely no written record whatsoever. And aspects of it look incredibly alien indeed. They didn't really have streets in the way that we would have streets. They're sort of subterranean passageways, so you had to slither through. And more than that, they didn't really have any kind of form of rubbish collection back then, so they just used to smear the outside of the huts in these kind of wraps of their own organic waste. And the whole thing, as a result, sank down and became a subterranean settlement. That said, when you peer into some of these concentric caverns, much about it does seem surprisingly familiar. You see things that you may very well have in your own houses or flats back at home. Things that speak of a kind of gentle domesticity, such as a bed frame and fireplaces and cupboards, even fridges that were sunk into the earth and contained these swirling limpets. And when you peer in to this reconstruction in particular, it's not quite what you'd imagine if you've got this mental picture of these sort of primitive people kind of clinging to the cliff face and trying to eke out a meager existence. But actually they're much more spacious than you would imagine. And it heralded a completely new way of life. So for the first 2 acts of the Stone Age, which lasted for 2.5 million years, and this is something that really struck me when I was writing this book, you realize just how fragile civilization is and how recent it is, and potentially how foredoomed it is. Like, this could be the very point at which we took the wrong turning for reasons that will become apparent, because this was a completely new way of living. So after those 2.5 million years of being hunter-gatherers, humanity began to put down roots, and they began, instead of forever marauding over the land, they began to till the land and work it make it grow. So stationary living was nurtured by agriculture. And places like this were extraordinarily experimental because up until that point, built structures would house not the living, but the dead. And if you think about it, that actually makes quite a lot of sense, sadly, because their life expectancy was woefully low compared to ours. And sort of the life itself seemed the most ephemeral thing in the world, which is why when you go to Orkney, as a lot of you have, I know, there are those incredible religious monuments in the middle, the chambered tombs, and so on. And these are aligned so that at certain times of year, the sun rays and the moonbeams beautifully illuminate it. And they were trying to sort of dignify their meager lifespans with a kind of cosmic significance by linking it to the sort of unseen forces that governed the universe. But for some reason, around about 7,000 BC, this didn't happen just in Britain. Obviously, it happened all around the world. We think it's probably to do with climatic shifts because it happened in places that didn't have any kind of trading connection whatsoever. Agriculture is embraced, and this lays the foundations for civilization, lays the foundations for literacy and trade and sort of political structure to society. So it's almost no exaggeration to say it's the point from which our entire civilized history unfolds. But then, of course, if you have civilization, you eventually have industrialization, and we're beginning to, well, more than beginning to feel, we are feeling the nefarious consequences of that. Skara Brae flourished for 750 years. I've been emphasizing what's relatable about it, but other things are not so relatable, such as their practice of burying humans beneath walls, because they thought, why should the earth bother to prop up these buildings? Let's give it a treat, a sacrifice. So you find lots of bones of their relatives. And so we hope those people were not buried alive, but we can't be sure of it. It's thought that's where the haunted house myth comes from, but we're not sure about that. Also, something people often ask is was it a violent society? Because again, that's part of the mental picture. But as far as we can tell, excavations have shown that it didn't have any defensive sort of structures whatsoever. So they seem to live relatively peacefully, because at that stage, the population of the Isles was only about 20,000. So there wasn't much competition for land, at least not at that stage. Round about 2,500 BC, the whole population vanishes. We don't really know why. There's a number of theories. It used to be thought because there was a humongous sandstorm, which made everyone flee. That doesn't really make sense because people would have just dug the sand out and moved on. It could be because some sort of nasty anthrax or other pathogen leapt across when you bring animals into closer contact with humans, as we've seen recently. Not a good idea half the time. It could be because they thought the site was cursed in some way, or perhaps the young just drifted away. It coincides with the eclipse, if that's even a word, of stone with bronze as the kind of metal du jour. And perhaps the Orcadian elites didn't really recognize the potential of this new metal, and that led to a decline. It was only discovered in 1850 after a huge storm ripped the kind of knoll off a sand dune, and then everything that I've been showing you was preserved exquisitely in the sand underneath. Initially, the sea was about a mile out, but look how close is it today. So just as it was lost for over 5,000 millennia, perhaps, again, this is going to be washed into the sea. Beyond that, we know very little. We don't know how they saw the world. We have no sense of their worldview, what they believed, what their currency was, how they spoke, anything like that. It's like trying to respond to a piece of abstract art. And although historians don't like this being said, sometimes all you can hear is the wind in your ears and the joys in the guessing. However, what we do know is that it paved the way for the emergence of villages, towns, and eventually cities, some of which were recovered. We talked about how striking it was that storm happened to reveal this lost underground world. Some of these places are revealed, dug up, in even more extraordinary ways. Has anyone ever been to Trelec? Okay, good. I'm going to transport you there now. Doesn't it look beautiful? A mist-swirled rural village is what it's become. It's named after these three stones that were meant to have been hurled there by a furious giant. Trelec, place of the three stones. But there's something rather mysterious about Trelec, because if you spend your time, I spend much of my time reading medieval tax records, they're incredibly detailed, and you can get a real sense of the population of these medieval cities. And according to the record from 1288, this had a population of about 10,000, if not 20,000, if you take into account people that lived outside the walls. And that would have meant that it was the biggest city in the whole of Wales, which is rather extraordinary because if you go there today, as you can see from these images, there's really not much left. There's a church, there's one street, there's one pub, and very little else. So there's this mystery for years, for centuries. People have been wondering what on earth happened to Trelec, the capital, the lost capital of medieval Wales. Where is it? And people had ideas about where to dig, professional archaeologists, but they'd really found very little indeed, mainly just rubbish. Until one day in 2002, a farmer noticed something odd about the molehills in his field. So whereas a sandstorm was the kind of medium of resurrection in the first place I took you to, in this instance it was just a mole boring blind into the earth. It seemed to have managed to have found what the archaeologists had been in vain looking for. It seemed to be turning up shards of medieval pottery in a field to the south of the church. And there had actually been rumours flying around that maybe that was in fact the true site of this, but no one had been able to do anything about it because it was farmland. And then even more serendipitously, the field came up for sale. This reached the ears of a 26-year-old archaeology graduate called Stuart Wilson, who immediately did what anyone should do in such a circumstance, which was to gather up his life savings. And I think he actually got his inheritance before his parents had died. He was so sure, bought the field because he was so convinced that beneath it must lie the lost city of Trelec. And people thought he was absolutely insane. He was castigated by the professional academic community that said, we've been doing our proper digs, proper funded by universities, and here comes this kind of amateur who's just kind of going around making a lot of noise, and he ain't going to find anything because he's not digging in the right place. But he proved them all wrong. Within a couple of seasons, he dug up some really rather extraordinary things. He dug up a mummified cat, a beautiful jewel-encrusted pilgrim's flask, and a roof finial, which I don't know if anyone's got one at home, which is, if you have it on your roof, it means the witches won't land on it. So these things that speak to the medieval worldview in the way that you could never have done for Skara Brae were found. And that was just in a couple of seasons. Not only that, it soon became one of the world's biggest and most democratic digs. People travelled in from all over the world to spend a season digging in this field to see what they could find. And the more they dug, the more the earth gave up its secrets. The more this guy became convinced that he was digging up the core, the main high street of what had been this medieval metropolis. And as the Al Jazeera branding thing there hints at, the media got wind of this early on. And this is something you see again and again with these lost cities, is that they're sort of blank canvases onto which people project. I perhaps didn't realize it at the time, but pretty much every single lost city I went to, it represented a side of myself that I'd kept suppressed, and it helped me kind of come to terms with that. The media had an absolute field day with this, and as you can see from these, a sort of key facet of it was that he was the underdog. People were saying, no, you're mad, don't bother. But he followed the strength of his own convictions. He put two fingers up to these gloom bucket naysayers, the academics, and he found, hiding in plain sight, this utopia. And everyone saw it pretty much in the comments as a metaphor either for Brexit or for Trump, bizarrely. And it triggered this protracted kind of academic warfare between him and the academics. It got really bitter on Twitter. And they said, he wasn't digging up any city, he was just building his castles in the air. Like, how could this possibly have been a lost medieval city? On a landlocked plateau beyond a forest without any river, how could you have had somewhere which, as the tax records show, went from about 320 people to about 10 or even 20,000 people within the space of 50 years? So it was all a bit of a mystery. So I set out to rock up and find out what was what and see if I could cast any light on this. I'm not an archaeologist, but I wanted to look into the historical records and put the whole thing in context. So that's where it was. And I remember vividly, I was really insistent when I was writing. I was not going to drive anywhere because that would have been improper. I wanted to kind of experience it at a slower pace as contemporaries would have done. So I decided to cycle. And she'd sort of burst out laughing in my face when I said, I'm going to go down to Trelec on the bike. And she said, you won't be going down anywhere, you'll be going up. And sort of hopelessly misjudged. This became a recurrent theme. I found myself lost in the forest, a very sort of Dante-esque moment. And it took about 8 hours to get there. There's a picture of me looking bemused, but eventually I was expecting a bit more fanfare, a sort of ruined medieval gate at the very least, but I just found this tiny little sign. And actually by that stage, my proper phone had run out of battery, so I was relying on this ancient Nokia, which is why it's got this kind of retro quality, which I think is quite pertinent in a way. Like a tiny sign looks like a kind of village fete. This is where you get the handmade cake stalls or something like that. Very little there, and I wandered in. I found a mound on which once stood a castle, a Norman castle, long gone. I found the church, not a soul in sight. There was one shop, one pub. I saw about 3 people. I found a crossing, and actually one of the most peaceful spots I think that I'd ever found in my life was a wishing well. The landlady actually told me that it was a wicked well as well, and she made very clear that she'd cursed her ex-husband by flicking pennies and wished all sorts of terrible, which I won't go into. But when I was there, it was actually an incredibly peaceful place, and I felt something of these academics, perplexity. Like, how could somewhere like that have been this big, sprawling capital? Well, the key is, I think, thinking what was going on in Wales at the time. What indeed was Wales? In the wake of Skara Brae, you had the Celts, then you had the Romans, and that disintegrated. Then you get the waves of Anglo-Saxon invaders, and they were determined to crush those querulous people in the Western Annex. The Brits, the Brythonic people who had this continued connection with the Celtic civilization. So what the Norman kings did was to carve out, to gouge into the earth beyond Offa's Dyke, what were called marches, which were run by warlords, essentially, like the marches of Shrewsbury and Herefordshire and the rest of them, which stretched all the way down from the north to the south. And this was the first chapter in the sorry history of England's colonisation of pretty much everywhere. They started with Wales. And they filled these places with Norman settlers and basically crushed the inhabitants and sort of drove them out further west, particularly to Gwynedd, to the northwest, which was seen as the kind of last stronghold of pure Wales. And this was like the Wild West of Britain back then. There was so much fighting. It was a lawless. If you read the kind of Journey Through Wales by Geoffrey of Monmouth, horrific accounts of sort of torture and pillaging and sort of ethnic cleansing, really, that was going on. And the reason the kings did this was to reward the nobility for being loyal. And they began to strip away Welsh nationhood. Eventually, Henry VIII would make it illegal to even speak in Welsh if you wanted to get on anywhere in public life. And it was really Edward I, who we know as the Hammer of the Scots. He was also the Hammer of the Welsh. And one family was called the De Clares, and they were his kind of chief ally in the marches in crushing the native Welsh, who kept on attacking, as you would imagine, these strongholds. And if you have these campaigns, you need ammunition, you need spears, you need shields, you need all sorts of grisly torture devices. And it was instructive that what these professional academics found, the archaeologists, I should say, was smithies and forges. The Forest of Dean, that was the forest in which I looked perplexed, is full of ancient slag, the waste product when you try and make iron. So when you put two and two together, how on earth could it have gone from 320 people to 10,000 within such a short space? Well, it was a boom town. It was an example of a place which rose to great prominence extremely quickly, but then exhausted the supply of this kind of valuable natural commodity. And as so often as happens with the American gold rush towns, for example, the boom town is often the foredoomed town. It can never last for that much longer. And to make matters worse, the whole De Clare dynasty were killed in a crush of armour at Barrockbourne in 1314, so they lost their patrons. So then this place, which had had such an extreme economic specialisation, just withered away, died, became buried beneath the earth, until when you look at 17th century newspapers, it's just referred to as a village, paving the way for this peaceful place, which you can visit today. So it existed, believe it or not, when you look at such fantastical tranquility, because it was a turbine of war, and yet nothing about it would suggest that. This was our equivalent, if you like, of the Californian gold rush towns. So that fell prey to oblivion for those reasons, because it was unhealthily dependent upon one thing. The same cannot be said for another city that was founded around about the same time. Has anyone been to a place called Old Winchelsea? You've been to Old Winchelsea?
I've been to Winchelsea.
Ah, okay, yeah. I was going to say, for those of you who've been to Old Winchelsea, you must be really good at diving, because that's it. That's it. So you're standing on the beach. To your right are the cliffs of Fairlight, and to your left the great shingle promontory of Dungeness. I'm sure some of you would have been to Derek Jarman's house and the rest of it, and you can just make out the nuclear power station on its tip. Now, there used to be a shingle spit going from those cliffs to the power station. Obviously, there wasn't a power station at the time. And on that shingle spit was built this amazing city. It was like a kind of tagliatelle of twisting, winding streets, passwood and seawater, where the land turned. That's what Winchelsea means. It means kind of islands on the bends. And that may sound like you're really tempting fate to build a whole city on a shingle promontory, but as you can see, for those of you who've been to Dungeness, it's not actually that flimsy. The ground is quite solid, and then, as now, you can find all sorts of strange buildings on it, like that. So actually, this was a smart place to build the city, because it was close to the narrowest crossing with France. It was called the Narrow Seas, and it gave people unrivaled access to that great aquatic highway of commerce, the sea. So in was imported, garlic from San Sebastian, mirrors from Castile, blue wort and dyes from Venice, and most crucially, delicious light pink frothing wine from Gascony. It was one of the major ports of the southeast, and it was one of the king's, still Edward I, favourite mustering grounds for his campaigns over sea. Unfortunately, from 1250, the climate deteriorated. So what was known as the medieval warm period gave way to the Little Ice Age. This had nothing to do with human behaviour. It was to do with a subtle shift in the Earth's axis, an upflare of solar radiation, and volcanic eruptions. I have no idea quite how that's been pinpointed with such accuracy, but that's what was going on. But as we do know from our own time, when you have climatic shifts, they're often accompanied by, manifested by extreme weather events. And it was no different from them. From 1250, these storms would batter the city, ripping off entire streets, clawing more and more of it into the sea. You can imagine the kind of timbered beams that they had constructing their houses in those days would have been turned into battering rams and just crashing into other buildings and knocking them into the watery abyss. And this penetrated the shingle spit. Things never really got better. The king himself, Edward I, he was a macho king. He was not the kind of person to sort of say, well, I'm just going to let that be. He turned up what we would call a fact-finding mission. And he said, is there anything that can be done? And there's this rather harrowing proclamation that says most of the city is ingressed by the water and the rest is hopeless long to stand, which are words that could very well be applied to lots of our own coastal towns and cities in the future. And he began to scout out locations for a new, bigger, better city. And that took him to a place called the Hill of Eyam, which was several miles inland. It was on a hill, which is good when you're trying to get away from the sea. Shared a broad tidal estuary with Rye, which I'm sure a lot of you have been to. And he couldn't have done that at a better time, because in 1288, as the chronicler Matthew Paris put it, the sun vanished from view, the sea whipped itself up into these dark, undulating mountains, crashing down upon the shore, and Old Winchelsea was never seen again. To this day, no one really knows whereabouts it is. It's somewhere in that sort of watery expanse. But that was okay, because he'd built New Winchelsea, and not just built it, he'd built it in a completely new way, as a kind of medieval Manhattan. Most medieval cities were just a mess. They were like a sprawling labyrinth, crooked, very little sense of order. New Winchelsea was different. It was rigidly carved into these crisscrossing streets on a sort of orthogonal grid, which, as you can see from this one, they actually call, if you look top left, they call them like First Street, Second Street, Third Street, into blocks and quarters around St. Thomas's Church and the Monday Market, going all the way to the south. This was a huge city. It was the same physical size as the City of London, and conditions were ripe for huge success and expansion because it shared this trade with Rye, and it had a booming import trade, especially well, we'll find out what in a minute. Just before that, the topography was highly calculated to send out specific messages. So this was meant to be a sort of sign of resilience against the kind of chaotic forces of nature that had laid Old Winchelsea low. That's why everything was laid out so precisely. And to this day, one of the most striking sights are these little caves projecting into the street. You can still find about 30 of these, but back then there were over 90. And these were quite astonishing places. They were part wine tasting cellars, they were part sales rooms and part taverns. And just think of them as wine caves. And it's not something we have in our mental picture of the middle. If you watch Game of Thrones or something, it's always just a boorish alehouse where people are drinking and fighting and telling bawdy stories. But actually, these places were upmarket. They were for the lawyers and the scribes and the falconers and the kings and the princes and so on. And if you'd walked past of a summer evening, or indeed of a winter evening, you would have seen gargoyles uplit by flickering candles, lute music bubbling out. And if you'd ventured in, you would have heard the coughing and the guffawing and the laughter. And you would have seen merchants from all over Europe piercing barrels, and just this stream of kind of light pink wine would have gushed out. And that all came from Aquitaine and the Bordelais, which of course was back then a dominion of the English crown. And every year, these transshipments would cross the narrow seas and gush into these wine cellars. So there was more wine cellars in Winchelsea than anywhere else. This was a wine metropolis. So in the wine, it found its status and swagger and prosperity. And that's very much how it would have been known at the time. They called it the creator of the world's happiness. They said it was something that would take misery and remove it from the soul. In those days, they didn't, like we, rather boring, you just have red, white, and rosé. They had every color of the rainbow. They had black wine, which was just extremely strong red, which would knock you out. They had gold wine, in which molten gold was melted. They had green wine, in which apples floated. They had winter cherry wine, which was blue. It was a whole sort of culture. There was no sense that drinking too much of it was bad for you. It was also seen as the keys to salvation, just as the Romans had thought you ingested the spirit of Bacchus. That's what made you marry. The Christians were that you need, this is the blood of God. And according to the inventories from Winchelsea, the average intake of wine for a wealthy citizen was 5 pints a day, which is quite a lot. Even if you spread it out, that's about 3.5 bottles a day, every day. Even children were given wine soup. I found a little note saying you should try and wean the baby off wine after 7 months, if you can. Maybe it stopped the babies from crying, I don't know. But they were addicted to it. And because it was the lifeblood of Winchelsea, there was piracy at sea. So the Castilians and the French tried to intercept these transshipments. And many were the times when the people of Winchelsea would be sailing back and they'd see a sort of floating crucifix rearing out of the mist. And before long, they'd find themselves in the icy waves, flailing about, sinking to the ocean floor as the pirates would be guffawing. But the people of Winchelsea were the most brutal pirates in the land, pretty much. Their speciality was actually to attack other British cities, like Southampton, and they'd swirl about until the whole city would have to retreat in terror. Then they would raid the shore, round up men and dogs, and they would kill a man and hang him next to his dog, and then swirl around other cities. So you see in the distance just the dead corpses of sort of men and dogs with the feet kicking into snow. Really gruesome stuff. So you didn't want to mess with people from Winchelsea. There was a real bravura and violence about the place. Things look all set. Rapid expansion. After 1350, a huge battle was fought and won off the coast, the Battle of Winchelsea, which they did win. By this stage, more and more people are being sucked into that grid that I showed you. And it looks like its ascendancy is unstoppable. Which makes it all the stranger. When you visit Winchelsea today, new Winchelsea, not old Winchelsea, it doesn't exactly have the grandest of entrances or even signs. They don't even have a sign on the platform. It's just a block of absence. Then you sort of make your way up. I was a bit worried about how I was going to get across, after the anguish of the Forest of Dean. I was like, how am I going to get across this medieval estuary? But I didn't need to worry because what was once a huge stream has narrowed to this dismal little stream, and you can almost skip across it. Things look a bit more promising on the horizon when you do find one of the ancient gates. When you swivel around to the right, expecting, well, I don't really know what I was expecting, but certainly wasn't expecting a place that at best can be called sleepy, at worst almost comatose. I mean, again, there's just no one there. The whole place felt like a kind of perennial Sunday afternoon snooze. And then you see the cathedral, and it's enormous, like compared to all the houses around it. You think, what on earth has happened? It just dwarfs it. Where are the wines? There was just one pub that sold like disgusting. There was no yellow wine or blue wine, or it was just battery acid wine. And actually, the experience of walking around makes you feel a bit like a ghost yourself. because you can still feel, there's just a sense of loss. There's a fugitive odour of ruin and decline and listlessness everywhere. And it's something of a mystery when you get to the Monday market, to the quarter to the south of the church. If you look at the map, that was actually the centre of town. That's high up, 3rd Street. But when you get to it now, everything just stops. They're just lonely pastures. It feels like you've walked a long way out. It feels like you've left it far, far behind until you see some upended in the ground, like a kind of shard fired from outer space, just the wall of one of the hospitals. And then you walk for a bit longer over what were once bustling streets, with touts, pilgrims selling you little indulgences for your journey to St. James Compostela. Or, you go past what was the Yellow Cloak District, as what they call the Red Light District, places where butcher's meat would have been thrown out and cats sinking their teeth into just emptiness and nothing. Then the thing that really affects you is what was once one of the main entrances to Winchelsea, now marooned in rustic isolation, just a gate. So I expected more of an intake of breath there. One of you did it. But yeah, it's just pitiful and forlorn and lonely. And this begs the question of what on earth happens? Well, a lot of calamities were in store for New Winchelsea. The Black Death, for one. It was raided about 8 times by the French and the Castilians, who would sometimes come in, burn all the houses down. On one occasion, massacred all the chief citizens in the other church, the Church of St. Giles, which is where if you go there today, there's a place called Dead Man's Lane. It's very spooky because that follows the path of all the dead bodies which were just dumped in a twisting line after their massacre. It's still there today. But that actually those sorts of things affected lots of medieval towns and cities. Most of them would bounce back. Winchelsea didn't, because it couldn't cope with, having been laid low by nature once. It once again found itself in the crosshairs of nature when another amassment of shingle materialised in the sea, which slowly but surely began to block the harbour. So it meant that the bigger ships could no longer come in. The trade dried up. The process was exacerbated by ballast dumping and people inning bits of the sea because they wanted to bake salt crystals. And slowly but surely that huge estuary dwindled to the dismal little stream that I had encountered earlier on, until by Queen Elizabeth's reign, the first that is, there was just one sailor and he doesn't even have a ship. And then, because there's no water, and then they begin to guillotine it, making it smaller and smaller, banishing the southern quarters into the sort of ghostly Shadowland, for want of a better word. And if you just look at it there, that's all that's left today. Look at that puny little grid compared to that magnificent one there. And as I say, there's just one lonesome pub. And as Daniel Defoe put it, 300 years ago exactly, he said that the strange thing about New Winchelsea is nothing of the sea, but the destruction of it seems to remain. And it's a cautionary tale. You can overcome plagues and fires and human-made disasters, but when nature gets you, you are doomed. Which is a story which also has some relevance for somewhere on a completely different part of the country, which got obliterated initially at the same time as New Winchelsea was getting into difficulties. Anyone been to Warren Percy? Yes, 2 of you. Did you enjoy it?
It was a welcome respite on the walk.
Yeah, well, I completely relate to that because, again, on this one, I got completely lost, decided to set off hiking. Phone died, as usual. Had no idea if I was going in the right direction. This is the most famous deserted medieval village in Northern Europe, in the Yorkshire Wolds. So was dispirited, didn't know if I was going in the right direction, didn't know if I was actually going to find it. until I saw this. Very helpful. So sometimes these places are quite well marked, and that was really exciting when I saw that, because I was like, it sort of suddenly fibrillated. I didn't know what I was expecting. Again, I just thought it was going to be like halos of flies and rats scurrying about, and just piles of timbers in this like ruined medieval plague ghost town. But actually, with a lot of these places, it's quite an anticlimactic experience. It's not necessarily a bad thing, because it, galvanizes the imagination. But you go through a bumpy track, empty fields, and most of it you can't even really see because it's scorched into the earth. You need a flying license to look down upon it. But the true spectacle of devastation and loss is the church of St. Martin's, which looms up from the fish pools, and has this sort of eerie, otherworldly glow about it, as though it's landed from a different dimension. And you can see that was the high street. That's all that left of it, that there is left of it today. That's an artist's impression of what once it looked like. Relatively prosperous population of about 200, but now just that. So this was not just the fate of Warren Percy, but of other places too. And it was, of course, the handiwork of what we call the Black Death, but what they called the Great Death. People got wind of the fact that as they saw it, there was a cloud of poison in Cathay, as they called China, that was scudding across Asia, belching forth its poison down on the land. And good, they thought, good. These people are infidel, they deserve it. It's never going to get to Europe. So it posed a bit of a problem when it did land in Greece, lodged itself in Italy. The Lombardy apocalypse took over. Even then, people in England were saying, well, good, because we're the chosen ones and they're not. So it's just going to stop when it gets to France. And it did get to France, but then it did not stop. Much of Britain, for that period, became more shadow than land. Great cities fell silent. There weren't enough living to bury the dead, so you had these frightening lantern frame pits gouged into the earth, into which the bodies were shot every night. Ravens would fly through the air, pecking out at these, which was terrifying because they had such clear beliefs about all the things you needed to do to have a hope in hell of going to heaven, if I can put it like that. And all sorts of really vivid eyewitness accounts. One Italian visitor stared into one of these pits. There was one very near here in Whitechapel, and one in Aldgate as well, actually. Aldgate East Station, I think, is on the site of a plague pit. Anyway, this Italian visitor said, looking down at the body, he said it reminds him of a macabre lasagna. Said instead of the meat being separated by cheese, it was separated by layers of earth across the, if that's what you were having for dinner, and spare a thought. And this was the time, people thought they were soaking up the last glimmers of the universe's existence. Everyone would start the day by checking beneath their arms, in their neck, and something their groin, just to see through these bulbous growths, which was the token of death. That meant you could probably expect to be dead within a couple of days. The death rate was 50%, bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic, 3 different strands. But it really was hell. And we can only begin to imagine what sort of, well, we don't need to imagine because we know, what sorts of impassioned existential questions ricocheted around the nave and tower of St. Martin's. Some interrogative sermons survive that take the form of a question and answer sermon written into commonplace books. And the priest is like, you ask if, well, let me tell you. So this is how we can hotwire ourselves into how the medievals actually conceptualize this. And evidently people were asking, why is this happening? And the answer was sin. It's simply punishment for sin. That's why this is happening. But then there were a few problems with that. They were like, well, if that's the case, then why is the rapist down the street is fine, but the 1-week-old child has just died? How could the child be? And they would say things like, well, it's been taken to punish them for the sins of their father, or they're being snatched away before they can sin, a bit like a rupture. But one image that I wasn't expecting that recurs is this idea of God as an archer. And the priest says to me, if you really want to think about it in this way, think of God as an archer. He's normally really good, and he hits the mark every time, but sometimes he has off days and just shoots the wrong people, and that's what's going on here. So I don't know how that could have been much comfort, but these were the sorts of questions. So they would have limped back past the fish ponds, back to their quite spacious huts, and waited for the disaster to pass. And in time, of course, it did pass. And as I said, it only killed 50%, only. That didn't quite mean it to come out like that. But basically, it didn't affect the structures, the buildings. So although the chroniclers were like, all these cities are going to be destroyed, in fact, people would just go back, rebuild, start again. There's only about a dozen, maybe 2 dozen, places that were wiped off the map as a direct consequence of the immediate wave of the Black Death, which is some surprise. Yet, if you look at a map of Britain, later Middle Ages, all these dots were once flourishing places which no longer exist. And they can be attributed in an indirect sense to the effects of the Black Death. And this is because it wasn't so much the mortality that wiped out these places, it was the economic consequences. So sometimes you can't really feel the impact, the true impact of a pandemic, until you have a bit of perspective. And what was going on was because half the people were dead, demand for labour was not keeping pace with supply. So the supply of labour was massively outstripped by demand, which meant that there was only one person where there had once been 2 to till the land. So inevitably what's going to happen is the labourers ask for higher wages. The government does everything it can to stop this because it causes inflation as well. But people just keep on asking for more and more and more. And in the end, the landowners say, well, this is just not worth our while. We're going to get rid of these agricultural labourers and replace them with sheep. So if you've got a flock of sheep, you only need 1 shepherd or 2, rather than all these people working the land. So mass evictions all within 100 years of the Great Death, meaning that it's out with the labourers and in with the sheep. So there's all sorts of pamphlets about man-eating sheep. And that means that those 3,000 places just in England alone now cease to exist. So we're getting on a bit with time. A talk like this wouldn't be complete without at least a reference to somewhere that did suffer the Black Death, but it bounced back like most places. This is Dunwich. Who's been to what's left of Dunwich? More of you, okay, great. So as you can see, this map looks informative enough at first glance, but when you take a closer look, there's something incredibly ominous if you look at the bottom, because it shows the coastline shifts. And this was precipitated, this huge city, again, actually slightly bigger than the City of London, with 18 ecclesiastical buildings, 7 churches. Winchelsea only had 2, this had 7, built on a cliff and separated, as you can see, by that sort of sylvan margin that separates it from the grey waves of the North Sea. But those same sea storms that laid waste to Old Winchelsea struck Dunwich. On New Year's Eve, this is the first time it happens, 1288, people went to bed joyous. In the middle of the night, the storm struck. People in about a quarter would have actually experienced being propulsed backwards off a cliff into the sea and just drowning in the freezing waves. And the next morning, the survivors came down and they saw about a quarter of their city, just this great muddy swirl that Siebold captures so evocatively of kind of ravens and beams and the masts of ships and men, women, children, cattle, all just revolving in this swirl beneath them. And this precipitated a devastating process of coastal erosion. The sea, the great ruminating, indefatigable lip, as Henry James put it, kept on just like munching in and taking more and more of the city. And this is exquisitely captured with a medium that came into fashion in about the 1890s, the picture postcard. Right up to the 1920s, like we say, we're going to WhatsApp you. They would say they will picture postcard you. And it was seen as a peculiarly good medium to preserve vanishing worlds or disappearing worlds, which is why I spent so long looking at them. But this church was once the westernmost church. Do you see on the west, just make out the Church of All Saints. But then by the start of the 20th century, it's all that's left. That's 1906. And look what happens. The sea just takes more and more of it. Long since you consecrate it until there's just a sorrowful shard teetering on the brink as the cliff arrives, and then it falls, just like all the other churches, all the streets, all the palaces, all the owl sanctuaries, everything quite literally went under, vanished into thin air. And you can still go and stand on that cliff today, and you can stare out at the space in front of you. And there's an overwhelming feeling of emptiness and melancholy, which is not altogether unpleasant when you stand on that cliff and stare at, and you can imagine it all out there, sort of mouldering beneath these waves. And sometimes when there's freak tides, you can actually see the ruins of the churches rear. And it's said that you're meant to be able to hear the sounds of the church bells clanging from the deep. That's a bit of folklore. But this is an incredibly inspiring place for artists and writers, not just recently, but for hundreds of years, particularly the Romantics that were drawn to places like this and who almost fetishized ruins. So this is just a little bit further out of the town, Greyfriars Priory, and the great writers, musicians, painters used to come and sit with their back against that wall and just imagine Dunwich in its prime, thriving, contrasting it in all its bravura with its fallen state. And all these creative people found it incredibly uplifting, which perhaps is not what you'd expect. Henry James himself went and stood on that cliff, and he said it was desolate but also exquisite. He said the minor key was struck with such felicity it left no sigh unbreathed. I defy anyone to be disappointed in anything ever again at desolate, exquisite Dunwich. And this was something I found personally very much. It sort of made your own sort of anxieties and what seemed rather kind of sublunar and irrelevant when you've got an entire drowned city staring at you in the face. And perhaps that's the power of the ruins, because they sort of transform your sense of time. They represent kind of time in abeyance or time on hold. It's a derailment of what we see as the correct timeline. But they also bring into focus just the quivering fragility and transience of the present. You don't need to stress that much about the present moment because all your yesterdays have amassed as well. But they also seem to predict, more ominously, some kind of bleak reckoning, some kind of ending, whether that be in a kind of personal sense or a metaphorical sense or a societal sense. It's very hard to go to Dunwich and not just get extremely worried about climate change, because there you have, and although, as we've said, medieval climate change didn't have anything to do with human behaviour, it was caused by just the sort of extreme weather events that are going to become more and more frequent in the future. And perhaps one of the most moving sights is if you go a little further west, you find the Lepers' Chapel. Obviously, you can understand why they might want to build a Lepers' Chapel way out of the city, hence it survived. But look at all the different types of masonry there. It's peculiar. And for me, that's because what they did was they salvaged the stonework of the houses that were about to vanish into the ocean and used it to build the chapel. So it's a kind of quilt of loss, if you like. And it's somewhere that's actually quite hard to find when you go to Dunwich, but it's well worth it. And some people were very reluctant to give up the fight. One lady actually signed a 500-year lease just as the cliff was on her doorstep. And the sea used to spoon beneath the crack in the door. But she was like, well, it's never gonna... and then, of course, off it crashed, joining all the ghost churches underwater. Talking of which, this is our final one now. which I'm going to do very quickly because the time is ticking. This was perhaps the most haunting place that I visited. It's in Gwynedd, it's in North Wales, it's in the Tryweryn Valley, and I ended up staring into that, what looks like quite a peaceful lake, in the crepuscular light. Again, I'd hitchhiked there I'd walked there and I had to hitchhike back because I ended up in the pitch black. But it's a very peaceful spot. It sort of belies the significance of this because hidden within that, underneath it, is a drowned village. This was the lost village of Capel Caelan. And Capel Caelan is how I finished the book because it's unique in some ways because unlike with Dunwich, with Skara Brae, with Trellick, no one could really do anything about one of the sort of bleakest observations is that no one really knows they're in the shadow of oblivion until it's too late. But these people certainly did because they glanced at their Welsh language edition of the Liverpool Daily Post a few days before Christmas, 1955, and it said that, I think, there we go, basically the village was going to be drowned. Just as a little piece of news, sort of fun, not particularly significant. A few days before, they'd noticed these sinister men had appeared on the outskirts, sinking their spades into the soil and taking little notes. People said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "It's just for some, water project, which may or may not go ahead." And then they saw that. It didn't take them long to clock that would have meant the entire valley, including their village, would have been gone. So what was going on? They called a meeting to find out. It turned out that Liverpool, the great industrial city of the north, claimed that it was running out of water and had decided that they needed a new source. And for reasons which are bizarre and still don't really quite make sense, they decided that it absolutely had to be Tryweryn in the valley, even if that meant the drowning of the village. This lady here, Bessie Braddock, Elizabeth Watkin-Jones was the tireless campaigner for Capel Caelan and came up against her nemesis, Bessie Braddock, they look rather like Hitchcock villains here, I think. And she was a Labour councillor. It absolutely must go ahead. There's no way, we're a tight little island, and if one part has to be sacrificed, then so be it. That's the price of progress. So it was a corporate Goliath against this rural David, but so much was at stake, more than the village itself, because this was one of the last bastions of that very Welsh nationhood and culture that had begun to be colonised and stripped away, going all the way back to the medieval Trellick that we've already looked at. So they try letters, they try protest marches, they even try bombs. None of it can defeat their nemesis. And it's voted through overwhelmingly by English MPs. I think there was just one Welsh MP who, for some bizarre reason, said it should go ahead. And slowly but surely people are forced to make terms with the corporation. This family did. They were given quite a nice new house in the hills in Bala, overlooking the dam, only to be killed in a car crash a couple of months later, and everybody said it was divine retribution for their treachery. The bulldozers moved in, tractors moved in, and slowly but surely the valley was scoured. It was turned into this arid wasteland. Dust clouds, the last train to Capel Caelan trundled off into its sort of misty oblivion. The final lesson was taught in the school. The dissolution ceremony took place in the chapel before the whole thing was ingloriously smashed to pieces. And then slowly but surely, they dammed the river, Tryweryn. The waters rose and people went to stand at the same spot that I'd gone to stand in, staring down, looking at where they'd grown up, where their relatives were buried, where they had expected they themselves would be buried. And it all just sank beneath the waves and people could actually see it going up. And the Corporation of Liverpool, with astonishing tone deafness, decided that, as though that were not enough of an outrage, they were going to have a glorious send-off. They were going to have a tea party on the bank of Tryweryn to celebrate this great feat of modern engineering. And you can imagine how that went down, with all the rioters and protesters thwacking down on the windscreens and shouting through the windows with megaphones. But nonetheless, it went ahead. They didn't get very far. The Lord Mayor of Liverpool and 2 of his associates, people were throwing bricks and actually setting flags alight, and you could see the Union Jack flag scudding across the surface, very symbolic. And they sang hymns in Welsh, which meant things like all the English are arseholes, but the Liverpudlians didn't know what the language meant. They had enough of that. They yanked on this lever and filled the valley with billions of gallons of water, and the residents could only look on as they were quite literally drowned out, just as the 3 men from Liverpool had been drowned out earlier. And many people say that when you visit today, the water seems restless and pent up, but that is not how it presented itself to me. It was this kind of oasis of calm, almost, because it didn't go under in vain. This is still very much in the Welsh consciousness. And sometimes physically it rears up the ghost of the old village from the deep. At times of drought, it reappears and it's mysteriously spray painted with things like drowned by English pigs, like this kind of Golgotha. But the memory of it lived on. It was frequently invoked by Welsh nationalist politicians. It's argued that it had quite a lot to do with a measure of political independence being granted, the Welsh Assembly and so on and so forth. And the memory still lives on. You know, Ian Sinclair described this book as a shamanic consciousness for the borderlands of memory. And I found a lady in the archives, she'd called all 5 of her children Caelan, just to perpetuate the memory of this village. So as they say, remember Tryweryn, it did not go under in vain. So to finish, I wish I could say the book had just been a work of history, but there are many places around the coast which themselves find themselves in the shadow of annihilation today. There's a Skipsea in Yorkshire. Many rows have already fallen in, and the rest are, as Edward I put it, hopeless long to stand. On the other side of the archipelago, you have Fairborn in Wales, where the council has actually given up trying to stop the incursion of the sea. They've embraced a policy of, as they call it, managed decline, and that will be going under. And we're in London. Lots of reports, lots of predictions, forecasts. So they're fallible, but forecast after forecast has shown that depending on the degree of carbon emission mitigation, it's not really a question of if London is going to be underwater, it's more how much of London is going to be underwater. There's some pretty bleak reports referenced, and so don't read the footnotes basically if you don't want to be depressed. But who knows, perhaps one day, just as all those promeneurs and romantics and writers like Henry James stood on that cliff and stared out into the watery abyss, maybe similar people will go to Hampstead Heath and look down at the sort of watery wasteland below, desperately trying to hear the sound of the bells of all those 50 Wren churches clanging from the deep as the city itself languishes in its watery grave. So on that really cheerful note, thank you for listening. I probably went on for way too long. Are there time for questions? Or? One or two, okay. We're not going to be dragged out? Or...
Yeah, well, we might do.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, yeah, it's 1 or 2 questions, yeah? Anyone? No? That's great.
Oh, there was one over there.
Yeah.
Out of all the places you visited for Shadowlands, where would you recommend us going to the most?
I'd say probably St Kilda, which helpfully I didn't even mention at all because there wasn't time. But that's the Outer Hebridean Islands, which was finally evacuated in 1929. And it's just an astonishing landscape. It's like sort of sea mountain, the halo of birds, and their way of life, which was quite an autarky, was corrupted by the arrival of tourists who thought they were finding the noble savage, and over the years, life became unsustainable. So that's probably the most striking. The most emotional is probably either Capel Caelan or Dunwich. And Dunwich is a lot easier to reach, so I'd say, yeah, those three.
I say not Dunwich because I really love it. It gets crowded too much. Anyone else? Do you have a website?
I've got a Twitter.
Twitter. So if people want to ask questions later, if they read the book, then you can tweet it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just my name. It's just Dr. Matthew Green, and yeah, that's probably the easiest way.
Brilliant.
Yeah, if you want.
Okay, that's fine. Round of applause for Matthew.
Thank you.